Ladies and gentlemen, gamers, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be jumping into the Africa Corps deep dive. This is the last faction overview by Relic before the release of Co. 3, but certainly not least, as I know this is probably a fan favorite during the tech test. A lot of people love the Africa Corps faction, and for good reason. It's extremely well designed, very aggressive, very fun to play, very dynamic, and I'm really curious to see what they showcase today. I believe it's going to be showcased by DEVM, who is now on the balance team, gameplay design team for Relic. So it'll be really cool to see that high level perspective and gameplay. But let's jump in.
Everyone, and welcome to our final faction deep dive before Company of Heroes 3 launches in 2 weeks. It's very, very exciting times for us here at Relic. My name is John. I'm one of the community managers on the team, and I'm very excited to be joined by a couple of our gameplay designers to chat all things Deutsches Afrikakorps, our exciting fourth all-new faction for the franchise. So before we get into it, let's do some quick introductions. Jason, you've done a couple of these with us already, but for those who don't know you, can you let us know who are you and what do you do on Company of Heroes 3?
We know Jason. He's been here since the beginning.
I'm Jason. I'm a gameplay designer on Company of Heroes 3. I work on most things gameplay, but right now I'm focused on balance. I work on the game's balance. So
amazing. And Miguel, very, very happy to finally have you here as well. So for those that don't know you, who are you and what do you do on Co. 3?
Yeah, hello everyone, I'm Miguel. I've been mostly handling battle group and faction design, although I've also touched a little bit of balance alongside Jason.
Awesome. So Jason, your roots.
I looked at Miguel's last name real quick there, and my mind immediately read Marine Hero, which obviously is a horrible pronunciation of his name. But I think that's not far from the truth because DEVM is a total legend in the franchise. So anyways, let's continue.
It's in the community, you know, your days of playing some competitive 2v2 back in the day in Co. 2. But Miguel, for folks who don't know who you are or don't know you by your other moniker, what is your sort of background with the community, and how did you sort of come up through there, and how did you make a name for yourself there?
Yeah, so for people that don't know my past with the franchise, I started playing the game maybe since I was 10.
It's crazy.
And I basically pretty fast I started to have interest in playing the game competitively. So I made a name for myself playing mostly as Americans and playing tournaments. I won a few of them, and eventually made my way now to have a job at Relic, which is great.
Awesome. So I think you're being a little bit modest. I think you probably topped the leaderboards in a number of the factions at some point in Co. 2's history.
Yep.
And yeah, obviously you've been playing the franchise since the Co. 1 days, but very excited to finally have you here on camera with us, and obviously, you know, excited to have you both on the team. I think Co. 3 is in good hands with some really, really awesome players at the helm. So as mentioned today, folks, we're going to be doing our final deep dive on the Deutsches Afrikakorps, you know, talking about this all new faction at length, in depth. We're going to be looking at some gameplay. So before we get into that, as always, if you want to stay up to date on everything that we're doing with Company of Heroes, be sure to follow us on your social platform of choice: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, at Company of Heroes. You can also join co-development by signing up at companyofheroes.com. You can find our forums at community.companyofheroes.com. Our Discord is discord.gg/companyofheroes. And of course, be sure to follow us right here on Twitch so you can find out when we're going live, twitch.tv/Relic Entertainment. We're going to be doing some really fun community-focused play sessions and streams after launch, so you're going to want to stick around for those. But like I mentioned, today we're doing a deep dive on the Deutsches Afrikakorps. We'll be looking at gameplay, talking about their roster, their battle groups, and more. We'll also be reviewing a 1v1 multiplayer match and a massive 4v4 with all of our launch factions. So nice. Please ask your questions in the chat, and we'll answer what we can as we go along here. But before we get into that, I just want to set up our conversation. We're going to take a look at our latest trailer, which showcases the DAK. So let's watch that, and we'll come back and we'll talk about the faction.
I'm really curious to see the 4v4 in particular.
The Deutsches Afrikakorps. Mobile, mechanized, elite. Hailing from Germany and supported by Italian comrades, these soldiers are experts in desert warfare. Betting on flexibility over raw power, hit-and-run tactics are at the foundation of their military doctrine. They are masters of mobility, navigating vast spaces and using their agility to take out key targets with their wide array of armored vehicles.
So cool.
Blink, and you will be overwhelmed by their bold stride. The deafening roar of engines, the thunderous blows of cannons, the ground will shake under the unrelenting assaults of the Deutsches Afrikakorps.
Totally has that desert theme. I love the Africa Corps, man.
Awesome. Those trailers always get me hyped up. I always say that, but it's the truth. So before we jump into watching some of these games, let's talk about the DAK a little bit more broadly here. Jason, they're a totally new faction for the franchise. So I'm kind of curious what the big picture design philosophy, or maybe the intent behind introducing this new, more mobile, early war German faction was for the franchise.
Yeah. So DAK is the new faction. Is kind of like the more radical, the more new design. They are meant to be a highly mobile, highly aggressive, mechanized faction. We've tried, but not quite to this extent. We put a really large emphasis on kind of replicating the fantasy that the Desert Corps had created in their drive in the North Africa campaign. So they have a really interesting assortment of vehicles, and they have probably some of the more interesting mechanics that allow them to interact with that kind of gameplay.
So Miguel, I'm also kind of curious what some of the big goals were with this faction in Co3, and how might that differ from some of the other factions that we're going to be launching with? Like, what are we trying to accomplish with the DAK?
I think one of the big goals with the DAK definitely was to showcase weapon towing. Since it's supposed to be a very mobile faction, it would be perfect to have that mechanic being shown off.
Interesting.
Which is also why we see units such as the Flak 88 within the Tier 3. Another big goal was also playing a faction that played well around vehicles. We've had a few factions like that in the past. For instance, their mainline infantry receives a bonus when around vehicles. So that plays off the whole vehicle-centric, you need to make the two play together well. Finally, another goal that we had with the DAK was for the faction to be one of the most aggressive factions in the game.
Right.
But I think the other big thing that brought is that it's also a complex faction, just by the nature of also being vehicle-centric.
Right. So do you feel like there might be a higher skill ceiling, or is it just sort of like an initial
That's a good
when
question,
you're first starting to play the faction for the first little bit of time, you kind of need to take a bit to figure out those mechanics before you kind of come to grips with it?
Yeah, I would say definitely initially. It's probably tougher for a newer player to approach the faction just because of that. It also doesn't have the same conventional tools that maybe the other factions may have. So perhaps they have access to these, for example, the 254, which is one of my favorite units. It's definitely, within its role, it definitely plays differently than what the other factions offer. So there's like an adaptation to the faction.
Right. So maybe start with someone like the British and then move to the DAK.
Definitely.
So Miguel, I'm also kind of curious, where do the DAK fit in with Co3's multiplayer when compared to some of the other factions? I know you mentioned they're a little bit more complex, so there might be a little bit of a higher skill ceiling there. But how do we kind of feel like how are they the missing piece in the faction lineup for Co3?
Yeah. So in terms of aggressive levels, the Wehrmacht was always supposed to be the more defensive faction, and this one kind of plays within the more aggressive part. It's also supposed to be a lot more nimble as a faction than the others. Another goal that we
Okay, so let's pause it there real quick. So he just said that the DAK is the counterpart to the Wehrmacht on the Axis. The Wehrmacht being more defensive, the DAK being more aggressive. On the Allied side, you have sort of the same thing. You have the British more defensive, and you have the Americans much more aggressive. So it sounds like, based on what I'm hearing from the team here, that you have this dynamic where you have like the DAK and the British, which are sort of designed to counteract each other. And then you have the Americans and the Wehrmacht, which are designed to sort of counteract each other. And in a 4v4 team game or in a multiplayer game, you really have to utilize the full range of weapons and units and arsenal, things at your disposal to deal with that grouping, right, on both sides, allies and the Axis. So that's very interesting because if you look at the faction design, if you look at the tech trees, the Wehrmacht in the U.S., for example, this Axis versus Allied kind of counterparts, they look very similar in terms of their overall design philosophy. And then the British and the DAK sort of have that more linear tech tree path. So I just find that very interesting. So I'm curious to see if we're going to get a little bit more insight into that. And Miguel just finished by talking about the DAK faction being more fluid and dynamic and adaptable. So let's continue there.
We wanted, it was that the faction would scale well into the late game, even with a more like a rush type of gameplay. So we emphasized that the Panzer IIIs for the faction, for example, in the late game, you can upgrade them to be pretty damn good. And we wanted that kind of desert warfare style to play off of them. So in terms of where they stand in between the other factions, they might be more straightforward in their teching tree, but the way you play them is a lot more complex, and you need to flank a lot more with them.
Right.
Interesting.
So Jason, our gameplay lead, Matt, who's been on before, he always talks about faction pillars. I'm kind of curious. I'm actually going to pull up the faction roster while I get you to answer this. But I'm kind of curious, how would you describe those faction pillars specifically for the Deutsche Afrikakorps?
Okay, nice. I would like to see this tech tree.
So much like the earlier video said, the central ideas are being aggressive, mobility and mechanization, and we also have this concept of specialization slash what I call accumulation. So the DAK, one other really important mechanic is the armoring. So it's kind of listed in the corner there. But the DAK have this idea of using lighter vehicles than some of the other factions, but being able to specialize or upgrade them to the point where they're much stronger than they originally are, and they can fight with the higher caliber or the heavier opponents from the other theaters. So if we take a quick look through this tech tree, it is actually more linear than some of the other tech trees, particularly the Germans and the Americans.
Absolutely, yeah.
But don't let this deceive you. There's very much a tremendous amount of freedom for how a DAK player wants to approach the game. We did mention being aggressive and mechanization, but there are many different ways of playing the DAK. Some which actually emphasize quite a lot of infantry or team weapon usage. But obviously, the DAK have a large collection of light vehicles. So, so we have tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. They're kind of linear, but you can kind of go into tier 1 and go straight into tier 3, which gives you a lot of freedom in terms of, do you want to go heavier into specialist weaponry, so team weapons, or do you want to go heavier into like the mechanized park, which is tier 2? I'll turn.
Okay, very, very interesting. When looking at this, the first thing that comes to my mind that's very strange and peculiar is the fact that we have the Panzer III in tier 3. I just never would have assumed that if I had to guess what was in tier 3 for the DAK. I would not have assumed Panzer III, but historically speaking, the Panzer III was a much more common tank in the desert than the Panzer IV and the Tiger tanks, which were which were obviously very prevalent in the desert and utilized by Rommel and the German army, but not to the same extent as the Panzer III, contrary to popular belief. So the like they said, and they are referencing history and trying to be as historically accurate as possible. The Desert Army, the whole sort of philosophy with Rommel and everything was this, hit and run, fast moving mechanized army. The Desert Fox is the nickname coined to Rommel because he was so tricky and always on the move and so forth. So I love that idea is trickled into the faction itself. The second thing also in Tier 3 that's very peculiar to me is the fact that there's the Flak 36. Now, once again, very much utilized by Rommel in the campaign. He was using these Flak 36 to knock out tanks when he was short on anti-tank weapons and so forth. So I love that these are here in Tier 3. I think it's a very, very cool historical connection that the faction has. I love the difference in plays of styles of play, rather, because there's much different implications for, let's say, like Jason said, going from Tier 1 straight to Tier 3, grabbing a bunch of quick Panzer IIIs, which are not the most formidable late game tank, but if you get them very early and you hit with them very hard and they're very mobile, and you're utilizing your flanks and you're constantly on the move and on the go, this could be devastating, right? And then you could perhaps, I'm just kind of thinking on the fly here, switch your tech into these Flak 36s to knock out those bigger tanks as the game progresses and so forth. But regardless, you can gain an early advantage with those Panzer IIIs in the late mid game to early late game and hinder your opponent, right? That's why it's more complicated, because you have to take advantage of the window of opportunity that you have with these Panzer IIIs. And that's just one style of play. If you look at this tech tree, there's so much going on, but let's continue.
As well, one of their special mechanics is half-track deployment, as you can see on the far right there, which is basically timed bonuses that the DAK get every 6 minutes, which allows them to get a powerful battle group in for at a very large discount, which allows them to be really flexible and also gives them that opportunity to have that power spike and be aggressive at certain parts of the game.
Very cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. So before we jump into our first match for the day here, folks, the thing that I will say is that we are looking at a build of the game that is slightly newer than the what you would have played during the multiplayer technical test. It is still not our 1.0 build. I think there are a couple last minute things that are going into that one. So you should see some of the visual and audio changes that we talked about after that test, but not all of them. So just keep that in mind. Those should, however, be integrated for launch. And
see if we can spot
we're going to
any.
continue, obviously, working on improvements post-launch as well. So we're going to be looking at a match, I think, between you two, between Jason and Miguel here. Jason, I believe you're playing as the British, and Miguel, you're playing as the DAK. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Jason's
so
gonna
let's
get
maybe
crushed.
jump into that, and we'll get started here with
No
some
chance.
initial thoughts on this matchup, and then we can go from there. So opening up here, we have Miguel on.
Guys, if you think Miguel DEVM is going to win, go ahead and smash the subscribe button. If you think Jason's going to win, do nothing. You don't have to subscribe to my channel. You don't have to like the video. But yeah, I'm curious to see your vote.
The right side playing as the DAK. Let's maybe talk about some of those initial decisions. We always kind of talk about the early, mid, and late game. So Miguel, what are you kind of focused on here in the early game with the DAK? I see you already got the Kradschützen out to do some fast capping of the points. What other decisions are you making? What other things are you kind of thinking about here?
Yeah, so I start off by building a motorcycle. It really allows the faction to get on the map a lot quicker. And something I'll always look for when playing the DAK is to get on those fuel points rather quick, so I can get my first building up as soon as possible. Another thing that I look for is to have a solid mainline infantry force. So what I do here is I already have a Panzer Grenadier squad, and I'm going to do another one real soon to back it up. And these squads are pretty damn strong, especially against the British. They're usually better at long range. So a plan here is always to try and close in the distance on the British with those Panzer Grenadier squads.
See, what I really like about DEVM's opening here is he started with the motorcycle really quickly to cap a couple of those key points in the corners, but he's using his engineer and his motorcycle on the corners, and he's taking his mainline infantry unit straight up, not straight up the center, but through the center for like a hard engagement early, because that's his strongest combat unit. And this just plays into the DAK sort of theme because he's capping the corners. He's got that mobility with that motorcycle to help with a flank in the engagement. And there's just a lot of momentum early. I mean, look at this. He's moving so fast. It's just a minute and a half in.
Awesome. So Jason, you know, again, thinking about that early game, what do you think you should be doing here as the British to sort of respond to these initial opening steps from Miguel?
So as the Brits, there's a few important early on decisions. Basically, do you want to fight the DAK tit for tat, or do you kind of want to go for something symmetric and more defensive? So if I wanted to kind of fight Miguel here out on the map, I believe I'd make that choice and I'd go for the Dingo here. We played quite a few matches, so I don't remember exactly which one's which. But as the DAK, you have a lot of freedom in terms of what units you can get early on. So Miguel here opted to get extra infantry and the bike, but you can actually start with the 250 half track right out of the gate. So you can actually skip building infantry in its entirety, and there's actually a few strats that utilize that. Now, Miguel isn't going for that, but that's something I have to keep in mind as the British player. But yeah, so I think the main decision points is whether or not I go for the Dingo, which can actually push around the DAK a little bit. It's more heavily armored, can fight off both the bike, the Panzer Grenadiers, and 250.
So you mentioned the 250 light carrier, and that seems to be like a backbone piece for the Deutsches Afrikakorps, right? You can build it right out of your headquarters. If you use one of the call-ins, right? You know, those infantry come in riding on in one of those, and then obviously you have one of the upgrades that allows you to equip it with the cannon or with the mortar. So I'm kind of curious, Miguel, like if I'm a new player, what do I need to sort of know about that carrier, and maybe even specifically about that new call-in mechanic for the faction?
Oh, look how fast that motorcycle is.
Yeah, so the 250 is the first unit you can use in the DAK to pair up with your infantry. It gives the combined arms bonuses, which actually make your mainline infantry pretty damn strong.
Okay, this looks better. I've been looking for improvements in the graphics as they stated, and it looks like this field here, I don't remember exactly what it looked like during the tech test, but to me this looks way more detailed. The contrast is way better. It's way easier to identify your units. Overall, this area right here, this field, looks really good. And someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember it exactly looking like this. I think perhaps it's a little greener here and so forth, but this looks fantastic. You see the rubble here. There's the hole in the ground from an artillery shell. It just looks so much easier to identify your units. But anyways, let's continue.
But the other thing is obviously the half-track deployment system, which can get you an AT gun on the front lines rather quick. But it's not only the AT gun, you can also go for the LEIG, or you can go for the Assault Grenadier, or for the Panzer Jaegers. Any of those will empower you to be able to be more mobile at that stage of the game. And they also come at a rather big discount, which basically enables the DAK to continue to being the aggressor throughout the game.
So, Jason, if I'm a brand new player, you know, what is it that you would want me to know about the faction? Like if I'm going hands-on with the DAK for the first time,
Right.
You know, I'm sure a lot of our players will be, you know, if they didn't get a chance to jump into the technical test. What should I know about the faction as we get into it?
So the DAK is a little bit of a there's a lot of specialists in the DAK army as well, or there's a lot of ways to get different tools. So you can, for example, get access to the HMG, the assault grenadiers, and vehicles very early on. I believe Miguel actually goes for the flak half track. But one really important thing to think about is there's a really big emphasis on both attacking but also mechanized play. So one mechanic that's built into all of the Panzer Grenadier units, and all DAK infantry for that matter, are two things. So all DAK infantry can repair to some extent. So most of them have rudimentary repair, which is significantly worse than the standard engineer repair, but it is still repair. And the other mechanic is called combined arms. And so when DAK infantry are fighting alongside, so nearby allied vehicles, they gain a significant combat bonus. Now, because Miguel here hasn't opted for the 250 early on, he doesn't get this bonus. But he does get a lot of infantry power, which will, while he's not as...
The bullet tracers also look really good. I don't know if you guys noticed those bullet tracers from the MG. The sound of the MG sounds better, and the bullet tracers are not as like large, right? It doesn't look as obnoxious. It looks really clean, so that looks really good. But I love what they just said. So combined arms between your infantry and your vehicles is extremely important, not only for repairing them, but also for the combat bonuses you would receive. So you're highly incentivized to keep them close, and you can do a lot of flanking with, obviously armor and infantry, and then regroup your armor and infantry together for a stronger, one-dimensional push, or maybe a pull back together and repair. So again, playing into that complexity that DEVM is talking about, not necessarily in the tech tree, perhaps, but it could be, but very much so in terms of the maneuverability, the combat, and so forth. So very cool to see.
Powerful right out the gate. He will take advantage of this later on.
Right. Yeah. So you mentioned rudimentary repair. I'm kind of curious what the design decision or design philosophy around including that for the DAK was. Is it specifically because we had this emphasis on light vehicles early on with the faction, and we needed something to support that, or was there another line of thinking there?
Yeah. So a few things. So the main thing was to enable the kind of mechanized play that we wanted the DAK to emphasize. Like, it's not much of a factor right now, but it'll kick in as the games go longer, and especially in larger games. Now, again, it is rudimentary repair.
Okay, sorry guys, I don't want to keep pausing every 5 seconds, but I just want to point out, look how good the road looks here. A lot of people were complaining about the texture in the desert and in the sand, which is particularly hard to create that contrast for your units. But just way more attention to detail in this build, and it's not even the final build, so very happy to see that.
Most of the infantry, so it is significantly slower than normal repairs, but it does mean that you don't need a dedicated engineer unit to sustain vehicles. So we didn't want to shoehorn players into having to lug around all of these engineers to maintain whatever kind of vehicle play they're doing. So while it's less efficient, they can sustain vehicle gameplay or vehicle armies without having to sustain a large amount of The other part, we also wanted to represent how over time the DAK forces gained a lot of experience fighting the kind of battle that they did. And one of the things we want to reflect that by is by showing that the grenadiers or the DAK infantry are able to get better as the game goes on. So there are armory upgrades that both buff the, for example, you can upgrade your Panzer Grenadiers to 6 men, and you can also increase the repair rate, among other things. And this was kind of a way for us to represent how the DAK got more powerful, or the men of the DAK got more powerful and got more experienced over time.
So I am kind of curious about, when it comes to designing a brand new faction like the Deutsches Afrikakorps, I'm curious about some of the decisions that went into their roster or like their production buildings. How do we even approach this design from the get-go, Jason? Like how do you decide what unit goes where and like what teching has to happen before you get to another unit? Like I'm sure there's a lot of conversations and a lot of playtesting and a lot of design that has to happen, but maybe you can try and sum up that process for us.
it's a lot of trial and error. This was a huge challenge because we wanted to do something new. We didn't want to quite recreate what we had before. I know a lot of Co-1 veterans probably originally thought of the DAK as like PE 2.0.
Yeah.
But we really wanted to do something new with this faction. We wanted this faction to play differently from the other factions as well, but also without kind of falling into some of the traps we fell in before when making asymmetric gameplay. So there was a lot of trial and error into this, especially with vehicles, because another problem with vehicles is that they're really sensitive. They're probably the most sensitive unit class of our game. You make AT too good, they suffer. You make snares too good, they suffer. Mines, all kinds of things interact with light vehicles. So there was a lot of challenge getting in the right thing. So it was a lot of trial and error. We did look into the past for inspirations. We looked at PE, we looked at OPW. And also just we've gone through like 6-7 iterations of the main tech tree for the DAK.
Yeah.
And we've changed out units, we've changed out the
Wow.
tech tree, we've changed out mechanics.
That's crazy.
So it's just a lot of everything. It took a lot of time to get the DAK to work.
Yeah. So one change that you can actually see in this build that I want to call out that wasn't in the tech test is we, you know, along with vehicle weathering, which we have shown off in the past, vehicles actually now start a little bit dirtier, and you can kind of see some of the wear and tear lines. If these, let me actually follow this vehicle properly, you can actually see some of the wear and tear lines that now appear on the vehicles, like right from construction. So the art team is just doing a really, really awesome job, making these vehicles look and feel a little bit worn and rugged, like they're driving around in the battlefield.
Looks good, man.
So I am kind of curious about this point in the match. You know, we're about 10 minutes in. It feels like a pretty steady back and forth. You know, victory points are at about the same level. Miguel, what are you thinking about here as the DAK player? Do you feel you still have the advantage? Like, what's your next decision point? I know you just got the Martyr out on the field.
Yep.
What are you thinking about here?
Such a cool tank. Or tank destroyer.
So we're getting to the stage in the game where I'm not sure what Jason here is going for. So I might be expecting a Steward, which is why I go for the Martyr 3, which is DAK's way to have a mobile AT. Right now I'm also wondering if he's going for AT guns, which is also more or less the British main way of handling vehicles as well. Their AT gun is pretty good. But my plan right now is about making more vehicles and hopefully at some point swarm my enemy from every direction and decrew that AT gun that I just spotted.
So that's really interesting because the way I think about this is you have DEVM who started with an engineer motorcycle, 3 mainline infantry, and then assault grenadier. And of course he has his half track. And it's sort of incentivized Jason, the British player, to get an AT gun. And then he goes for an anti-tank gun. So it's interesting how he has all these light vehicles that are forcing anti-tank and possibly not only just an AT gun, but maybe a light vehicle counter from the British player, right? And then he's going to counteract that light vehicle with his own tank destroyer. So this, again, plays into the complexity of the DAK where you're being aggressive to try and control the tempo of the game, the pace of the game, trying to force your opponent's next move and then counteract that, hard counter that next move by always being one step ahead. And that requires a certain amount of finesse and tactical flexibility to be a proficient DAK player. And that's sort of what DEVM started off by saying in the beginning of the stream. So I find that really interesting because there's so many options that both players can choose in terms of their build orders and their counter units and unit choices, that this game could look completely different, like 7 times over. You know what I mean? So that's very exciting how much variety there is.
So Jason, it kind of feels like you're playing from behind here a little bit. You're having to retreat some units. You don't have victory points anymore. So what are you thinking about here? How are you trying to counter what Miguel is throwing on the field?
Yeah, he's definitely giving me a hard time right now. He's out microing me. Out microing me with
He's getting
both the infantry and the vehicles.
he's getting
Like, this
destroyed.
is kind of one of DAK's major power spikes at around the 12, 11 minute mark, when they have that park of vehicles that we need to deal with. But at the same time, they can either have an overwhelming amount of vehicles, powerful team weapons supporting those vehicles, or a lot of infantry. And Miguel clearly opted for infantry in this case. So it's a challenge because as the defending player, you kind of have to match counter to counter. So you have to get your anti-infantry to fight his anti-infantry, or your infantry to fight his infantry while your anti-tank fights his anti-tank. And he's doing a great job of marking my AT gun. It's kind of off screen here, but he's just sitting on me, preventing me from doing anything.
Yeah, and he also called in the flame variant of the Panzer III.
Jason.
So it looks like he's definitely got you on the back
Poor
foot.
Jason.
I wonder if we maybe talk about the armored support battle group, because Miguel, you obviously locked that in pretty quickly. What was your thinking around going with this battle group here, specifically in a 1v1 against the British?
Yeah, so this battle group, first of all, on the right side, offers two passives. One of them is increased penetration on the vehicles, and the other one is increased damage on the whole HMGs that are on the vehicles. Because I was expecting a Steward, I went with the left one, which is the increased penetration. And something that I really like about this battle group is the Flame Presence Trio, because it comes in a time window where you still won't have your usual Panzer IIIs, so it's well armored for the time that it arrives in the field, and it can deal with infantry pretty well. And knowing that Jason had the AT gun, this seemed like the best choice. Just flank the AT gun with this unit, and you can get it decrewed pretty quickly. On the left side, though, it has access to actually pretty strong air abilities. So I somewhat see it as the late game pre almost. But
So
obviously,
cool.
if I'm trying to finish off my opponent here quick because I have the advantage, I just went with the right tree and hopefully get those Panzer IIIs behind the enemy lines and get them working on Jason's infantry and the AT gun.
That is really cool.
So let's maybe quickly talk about teching Jason. You know, I did mention that a little bit earlier. So what decisions is the DAK having to make? You know, like I'm looking at fire support elements here in the light support company. You know, got support elements in the mechanized company. So what decisions do you think that the DAK player is going to be making as they kind of go through a match?
So traditionally for our factions, especially in Co, usually players have two decisions to make. Do I build more units from what I currently have access to, or do I tier up? Now, different iterations of the franchise have had different ways of approaching this problem. Like Co 2 had a larger emphasis of just always tiering up, for example. But in our game, we've put a significant larger emphasis on building now versus building later. So, for example, on my end, actually, I delayed tech in order to get out a few more infantry units because, as you can see at the top, Miguel is clearly pushing me down in VPs. He's using his power spike really well to convert that into a lot of pain. But the DAK, unlike other factions, actually have a third avenue. So rather than just building now units out of what you currently have or tearing up, you also have the third decision of, do I upgrade what I already have? So the armory, we can't really show it right now, but like the armory has a lot of powerful upgrades that allow your units to scale, which is a really big thing for us because we wanted the DAK to emphasize infantry gameplay. Oh, do I get this thing? Yes. You bloody tank. Anyway, the DAK have a large emphasis on light vehicles, and those who have some Co experience probably know that light vehicles really struggle to scale into the later parts of the game. And one of the solutions to that, other than just designing the vehicles to be a little bit more inherently scaling, is to give them powerful upgrades. So you can give them smoke, you can give them self-repair, point capture, and a lot of other things, a lot of little goodies you can upgrade to these vehicles. So there's actually 3 levels of decisions. So Miguel seems to be like he's sensing my weakness and he's just going for power. Just
This is so
now
brutal,
power.
man.
Oh, boy.
You see both the battle group and just he's not teching, he's not building units, he's just crushing with the flame pen.
Yeah, some bad manners here from Miguel as he's got you base pinned. So it doesn't look like you're gonna be coming back from this one, Jason.
Look how good the Martyr 3 look. You can't really see the Tank Destroyer here. It's a little blurry. But I noticed how the weathering effects, the damage effects, it looks really good. I don't know if you guys saw that earlier when there was a better angle on it.
So
But
this one was a shorter game.
Yeah, a little bit of a shorter game. So there's the GG. So let's quickly sorry, let me change this
For
back
the
to us here.
record, we have a replay where I win.
no one believes that.
Miguel clearly doesn't want to show that off.
Didn't want to show that one for the game here.
I don't believe that after seeing that
as
game.
I queue up our next match here, I'm kind of curious. You know, we talked about a lot of the new units and some of the new mechanics. Like if I'm a playing with the DAK for the first time, or maybe people haven't played a lot with it in our past tests, what are the new and unique ways to play Company of Heroes are on offer with the Deutsches Afrikakorps, and what are you most excited for players to go hands-on with the faction? Maybe Miguel, let's start with you.
I'm definitely excited to see people play with the Italian infantry from two of the battle groups that we have. I think people already saw a lot of the power that they offer. So we have the Guastatori and the Bersaglieri, which I think I just butchered the name. And they play a lot differently than the mainline infantry for the deck. Another thing that I hope to see is a lot of Flak 88 play, especially in team games.
Yeah.
Especially the mechanic that you can now tow them around. So if it's in a dangerous position, you can adapt.
So cool.
Even if the opponent maybe finds out your position with his own artillery in the game, you can just get it out of there. Another thing that I'm looking forward to is people just finding out more about the DAK armory upgrades, because I feel like in the tech test that we had earlier, people didn't really understand just how potent they can be. I'm hoping that these people discover a lot more of ways to play the DAK after they see those upgrades. There's even one that lets you capture territory with your own vehicles. So at some point, you could even go for a playstyle where you basically have no infantry whatsoever.
So that's really interesting, and it's very reminiscent of many RTS games that are competitive. StarCraft, for example. There's an idea in RTS games, and Jason sort of alluded to this, where you can stay on a specific tier, and you could leverage everything at your disposal within that tier by enhancing the units within that tier. So, like Miguel is saying, DEVM is saying, you can, let's say you go to tier 2 and you stay there, and then use the armory to really enhance and upgrade and make all of your units more formidable in that tier. You can gain a major advantage in tier 2 against your opponent, who might be skipping tier 2 and going to tier 3, which means he has a disadvantage for that window of opportunity. That transitionary point where he's going from tier 2 to tier 3 makes him very vulnerable against a DAK player who's specializing and upgrading and investing in his units in the current tier. So that once again plays into the DAK complexity of reading your opponent, being aggressive, constantly gathering intel, hit and run, leveraging certain abilities like vehicles being able to cap points, being on the front line with repairs and combat bonuses from combined arms mechanics. So there's just like a lot going on. I didn't even look at the armory during the tech test, so I'm guilty of what DEVM is saying, but very curious to see that moving forward.
All right, so let's jump into our second match here. So like I mentioned before, this is a 4v4. We've got a bunch of devs playing here. We also have a couple of we've got one of our Discord moderators, so shout out to Demonic Spoon, who played with us. So jumping into this 4v4, we have I believe 2 DAK players in the middle. I believe it's Miguel here from your perspective in the blue, and then Jason, I believe you're just above him here. Is that right?
Yep.
I think so, yeah. And then we have a Wehrmacht player on either end here at the top and at the bottom. So playing the DAK in like a big 4v4 is obviously going to be a little bit different than playing in a 1v1. I see Miguel's already locked in Italian combined arms and is getting out some
Cool.
Salieri soon here. But Jason, what do you think the approach should be for a player as a DAK when they're jumping into like a big team game?
So one of the really cool things of playing the larger team formats with this faction is that this faction has tremendous amounts of freedom of what you want to go into. So one of the factors that isn't as relevant in the 1v1 mode is indirect fire, artillery support. DAK actually has a significant amount of options for indirect fire.
Oh wow.
They have basically 4 in the base tech tree, and they have 1 more in the battle groups. So, you can, if you want to be the artillery commander, DAK is surprisingly good at that. There are also what indirect fire options you go for also change what you go. But also you can kind of do what I believe I do this in this game. It can be this mobile infantry mechanized force that you go around up and down the lanes supporting your teammates and attacking where your opponents don't expect it. Because the other thing is that, again, DAK is very aggressive and really mobile.
I love this
map. If you take
map.
advantage of that, it's risky, but if you take advantage of that, you can do tremendous amounts of damage.
This map looks so good. It's Winterline, I
Which is
believe.
Really cool.
Yeah, so I see that you both, as we mentioned in that last game, you both go for the 250 light carrier right away. So Miguel, maybe you can talk about your decision there.
Yeah, I think the 250, especially in team games, because the maps are a lot bigger, it's pretty damn strong to just get your infantry around. And as you can see here, I start already harassing. I'm not sure.
I think this is Will Ward.
Yeah.
Regardless, so the playstyle here in team games with the DAK is there's a lot of movement, and you can aid your allies a lot with just moving infantry around these AF tracks. I think we're going to see a little bit of that in this game, but that's definitely one of the strengths of the DAK in these big team games, is that they
Double
can
repair.
help your allies around the map just by crewing infantry in those 250s and moving around.
Right,
So good.
and we see that with Jason kind of moving up here north with the Wehrmacht player to I think this is David from the missions team playing as the US up top. We're not going to look at the bottom because that's me playing as the US, so we're not going to pay attention to that part of the map at all. So this is obviously a huge 4v4 map. This is Winterline, I believe, which I think is one of my favorite maps because it showcases a lot of really cool terrain and a lot of different
I love this
interesting
map.
aspects of the map. So as the Deutsche Afrikakorps, what are some of your initial decisions here in a big team map? You talked about mobility. You talked about sort of using those vehicles to support your allies. Jason, what do you think you and Miguel should be prioritizing here?
One of the other early decision points, and this goes for all of the factions to a certain extent, in the larger team games, you're kind of shaping the end army you want from the start. So one of the big decisions for the DAK is kind of how much infantry are you specking into? Because if you want a lot of infantry, generally it's a little bit better to get them out early so that you can start better get veterancy on them. But you can also just be like, no, I'm not going to go infantry this game. I'm going to go all vehicles, whether that be all indirect fire vehicles or support vehicles or combat. So as you can see here, Miguel clearly likes his infantry. So he's building mostly infantry. I think I'm actually doing the opposite. I think I've only built 1 infantry unit, and I have 2 250s right now. Yeah, so I think I have more vehicles than I have.
Right. So one thing we didn't really touch on yet is veterancy. I'm kind of curious what were some of the decisions around like how veterancy is applied to the DAK. It seems to be fairly straightforward when compared to some of the other factions. But Jason, maybe you can talk about some of the decisions around like the different perks and different abilities that units get when they vet up.
In acknowledgement of like all of the other things that have gone into the DAK currently have, I believe, the simplest of the veterancy. So those who have played Pro 2 will be very familiar with how the veterancy of the DAK work. as you deal damage and as you gain damage, you gain XP, and as you gain levels, you become more powerful. But there's really, it's pretty straightforward. Yeah, but the DAK do have really powerful veterancy abilities. Now, most of them are intended to add utility to units. So if you look at some of the other factions' veterancy abilities, they add power, but a lot of the DAK abilities are intended to give utility. This allows a lot of their earlier units to scale much better into the game.
Interesting.
And also, there's a big emphasis for the DAK on how you use units to gain really important to strength, which, a lot of these utility mechanics allow these units to mutually support.
Oh, nice.
What they could do in.
So one thing that we've touched on a little bit is the battle group decisions for the Deutsches Afrikakorps. So here, Miguel, you actually made a different decision. You went Italian combined arms. What's your focus here, especially in a big team game? Looks like you're just kind of rushing down this left branch, which is all Bersaglieri all the time. Improving their squad size, getting them the Breda. What are your decisions here?
Yeah, so I see that Jason is going for a more vehicle-focused strategy, so I decided to go for the more infantry-focused one. These squads are really strong in the early game stages of the game, and the left path of that tree enables that infantry to just scale a little bit better and keep the momentum going throughout the mid game.
Interesting. Very
And that
cool.
kind of buys me time to get my tier 2 and tier 3 vehicles. So that's kind of what I'm looking for here.
So he's investing heavily in this combined arms for the Italian battle group. He's going to double down on these upgrades for the infantry to help them scale into the game. So he's going to hit hard early, scale into the mid and late game well. And then he's, as he said, instead of going for those really, really early vehicles, he's going to be going for those more formidable tier 2 and tier 3 vehicles because he's assumedly saving on fuel, right? Because he's mostly infantry for the early game. So I personally like this style a lot. I think this is a really cool style to play. It's a little bit perhaps more predictable, maybe less aggressive than other DAK styles of play, but I like it a lot.
Right, and what about you, Jason? What do you remember what battle group you picked here?
I believe I went for. I want to say armored support. Because I'm going heavily into vehicles, and I'm also keeping an eye on the late game as well. Because I think one of my strats is, because I'm using a lot of half-tracks with infantry, I believe I have 3 half-tracks with 3 squads in them. I'm trying to minimize the manpower bleed that I'm doing. So while doing a lot of damage, going up and down, harassing my enemy, I'm also trying to minimize my manpower bleed so that I can amass a larger army later on. One big thing that I do in this game is I'm accumulating a lot of upgrades on my units. So I've gotten both the half-trap upgrade, which gives them more health and more armor, and the smoke upgrade, which also gives a little bit more health and gives them the panic smoke, the smoke disturbers, which allow my vehicles to escape. Which right now they're okay on my half-tracks, but later on they will also be present on my heavier vehicles, so on my tankers, which I will utilize. So the strategy is, I'll be very aggressive, helping my teammates mostly. I'm not as good fighting on my own because my opponent brings a lot of anti-tank. I'm kind of just screwed. But if I go where there is an anti-tank, where my teammates are, I can do a lot of damage, and then transition into a bigger army later on.
Here's John, USF.
Right, so we're kind of getting close to the 10-minute mark. Miguel, what are some big decisions that you're going to be making here shortly for your forces as you're trying to push out?
I'm low-key rooting for John here. I really want him to knock out DEVM.
With this mid here, trying to stay on top of this VP and this fuel, what's going through your mind?
As we enter the mid game, something that you always have to consider is how you want to start handling the imminent tank that the British could pull out, because the Sword is a pretty strong light vehicle. And right now, because I went for the 8-rad, I'm hoping to support it with a Martyr, because it's also a team game. Again, the map is large, so the Martyr is the perfect unit for you to have a mobile anti-tank platform. Another thing that I'm considering is how do I lock down the center of the map? And I believe that in this game, I go for the 254, which is the mobile artillery unit that DAK have access to. And I think also one underutilized unit that I've noticed people not using as much. It's a pretty fun unit. The other thing I'm considering is, because with a DAK, you always have to consider how much fuel you use for your mid-game units, such as the
here I
A-Thread,
Mm.
versus stacking up for your late-game units. So it's always a balance with the DAK, just how much you want to invest in those mid-game units.
Very cool. I love that.
Right. So going back to battle groups for a second, Jason, you know, the DAK have some really cool ones. You know, I love the Italian representation in two of the battle groups, and you know, we got some really fun light tanks from them as well. How do you feel the DAK battle groups sort of complement the core roster of the faction? You know, what kind of fun toys do they have on offer? You know, we've seen a bunch of them already, but I'm curious if there's anything specific that you wanted to call out.
So we have two battle groups that feature Italian units. We have the Italian infantry, and we have the Italian combined arms battle groups.
That reconnaissance tractor is so cool. I love the visuals behind that. And I also love how Winterline, this map that they're playing on, if you notice, is completely different in every segment of the map. On the bottom, right, in the center, and at the top, it's completely different terrain. It's like really well designed. And from a spectating standpoint of view, beyond just gameplay, which is also great, it's cool to be able to, for the spectator to jump from point to point on the map. And it's completely different scenery. In the north, you have a town. In the center, you have these trenches and these little hilltops. In the south, you have this large kind of high-low ground dynamic between the hills and the mountain. So I think it's a really well-designed map. Probably my favorite one.
And the DAK kind of have three or four ways. Three or four ways of kind of integrating Italian units into the army. They can there are strategies that basically replace large parts of your roster with just Italian units. So, for example, Miguel here he's replacing most of his infantry with Bersaglieri, which is the Italian rifle unit. And one of their really cool things is that they get really fancy hats, and they sprint everywhere,
Right.
which is really cool. They're really good runners. They were picked to have the highest athleticism before they were led into the unit. And they also have good marksmanship, so they're overall good infantry.
That's interesting.
The other unit, and I'm sure those who have played the tech test have encountered this unit, is the Guastatore Combat Engineers.
Oh yeah.
They are these scary-looking dudes with gas masks and double flamethrowers, and they completely they're just like Terminators. They go around and they
Oh jeez.
absolutely destroy.
Talk about a crossfire there. That was
Now
insane.
we have three light vehicles. We have the L640 tank, we have the M1340 medium or medium/light tank, and then we have the Semovente self-propelled gun. There are a lot of different options. Now, both Miguel and I didn't really opt for them here, but there is a strat, for example, where you can go basically purely in Italian units using the Italian Combined Arms group, where you go Bersaglieri, and then you also opt into both of the vehicles on the right side of the tree there. It delays your infantry a bit, but it gives you really powerful weapons.
Right. So, comparing those three launch battle groups for the DAK, do either of you have any personal favorites, Miguel?
Oh, look at that. The reconnaissance tractor has a commander on top with binoculars scoping out. I didn't see that. That is super cool. I never built that during the tech test, but I love that unit.
Do you just
Look at
love
him.
Italian combined arms? Is that what you always go for, or is it sort of dependent on the situation?
I wish they would zoom in on him there.
Sort of dependent on how I want to approach that particular game. Although I think my personal favorites are still Guastatore. I really like their passive capability of using the smoke and getting a buff when getting out of smoke. I think that's a really fun mechanic. And also, within this battle group, I really enjoy just I think the right side offers a pretty good strafing run. And I think the armored support one, I also enjoy it because of the flame peasantry. So it's hard for me to say what my favorite is, but yeah, I think the Guastatori overall are my favorites. They are really fun unit to use.
What about you, Jason? What's sort of the battle group you always kind of go to, or is it a specific strategy that you like to employ with the DAK whenever you're playing in testing?
So the Bursa strategy is definitely my favorite. So going a lot of Bursas and going to the Italian vehicles, I think is really, I really enjoy that. Though whenever I'm feeling, when I don't want to go that strategy and I just want to play more flexible standard DAK, I think the armored support battle group is a lot of fun. And then obviously if I want to just burn people to a crisp, then Italian infantry is kind of my favorite. Italian infantry also has some really interesting off-map abilities. So they have propaganda war, which allows them to force retreat units. Oh boy,
It looks so good.
I think I tried to help Will here and didn't do a very good job.
The graphics
yeah,
are looking amazing.
That one rifleman squad just tanked, just ate that bombing shot through the face. Yeah. So honestly, I like all three of them. If I absolutely had to choose a favorite, I still think the versus ones are my favorite. No, it's more because in the smaller modes.
Oh, nice shot.
I really like using the G40. So yeah.
Awesome. So it looks like you're both kind of just camping on these points here in the mid. Are you just kind of waiting for the allies to like, throw themselves against the brick wall that you erected here, or what's the next decision point, Miguel?
Now I'm probably looking into getting into the tier 3 and start rolling some Panzer 3s out. I'm not sure exactly what I do this game, but I usually in team games as a DAK I also like building a flag 88 just to secure the portion of the map I'm playing at, since it basically denies any late game vehicle that they could throw at me. And I'm also making use here of the lockdown ability on 254, which is the veterancy ability that it has to try and barrage my opponent a little bit further along than usually the unit can.
What about you, Jason? What are you kind of thinking about at this point? I kind of feel like you've all secured this game for yourselves.
Miguel has been camping a little, but I've been going up and down. So I've been fighting both in the north and the south. I actually haven't been giving the opponent across from me the time of day. I've just been avoiding them because I think they're running around with a bunch of Tommies with AT rifles.
Right. I think that was Marco, so he'll be hurt to hear you say that.
I was just avoiding him, and I was punching this American player up top. And then whenever, I guess Marco would show up there, I would just, just peace out, and I would go down middle.
Jason he's loving it.
One of the benefits of that is that not only do you have increased access to half-track, because with half-track deployment, you get free half-tracks throughout the game. You also can buy one. But you also get tank riding. So between tank riding and half tracks, so vehicle holds, tank riding, and then also towing. You can, as the DAK army, you can basically move up and down the map at will. Now, all factions have access to these tools, but the DAK really have been built around this, so they can kind of do it better than anyone else. So, yeah. So, for example, your infantry get combat bonuses when they come off the tank. Or when they're near tanks. So if you do descent tactics and you have a bunch of P3s with infantry on it, you can just ride them into battle and then drop them off and they're super powerful.
So Jason, this question is probably for you as we wrap up here, but in terms of balance and multiplayer balance specifically, what unique challenges do the DAK pose when balancing them for sort of a multiplayer or more competitive environment?
So I'm sure some of the some of the fans from Code 2 are probably stressing out a little, seeing the columns on the left side, some of the emphasis on being aggressive, some of the parallels to OW. Now we've tried to circumvent some of these these issues, but there are still some. I'm sure those have played the tech test have encountered some of the rough edges of the DAK. But the idea, one of the benefits is we are building with some of this experience in mind. So we're trying to do it better this time. One of the major challenges of a faction that's inherently aggressive is allowing them to be aggressive, but without making them overpowered. Because usually to attack, right, or the defender has the advantage. So you need some way to give players the way to mitigate that. But usually, a lot of the time, that just means extra power, which can result in just unbalanced faction.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Which can happen, but we're trying our best to make sure that
Oh,
doesn't happen.
Sick.
We've done a lot of things. We've built a lot of things into the faction to try and avoid that, where a lot of the things that allow them to be aggressive, for example, towing, half tracks, tank fighting, those are not unique to the faction, but also the faction can benefit more from it than other players. So that way there's counterplay, there's more skill involved. Hopefully that way we can make sure that we can maintain that unique identity without unbalancing.
It's a good point.
So I think we're gonna wrap this game up here right away. But as we kind of come away from this match, I am kind of curious. Jason, what do you think? Or maybe Miguel, let's start with you. What do you think the allies could have done to try and counter some of the strategies that the Axis were employing this time around?
They could have recruited DEVM.
Something that when you're playing against the DAK in team games that you always have to have in mind is that the DAK player can choose to aid his allies at any point because they are really mobile. So usually if I'm playing against the DAK, I go for less of a, units that have to hold their ground, so no HMGs, no mortars, and I go more for a more mobile kind of force. If I'm playing the British, I might go for more Tommy squads and the Dingo to follow the DAK player around. If I'm playing the Americans, I'll probably go with Riflemen and try to upgrade them as well as I can.
Mm-hmm.
Another point with the DAK is that
super good
even though
insight.
they have a mobile anti-tank platform in the form of the Marder tank, the tank needs to rotate to face your target to actually shoot. So a good thing that you can do is if you rush for your light vehicles such as the Stuart or a Chaffee or the M8, you can try and coordinate something with your allies to flank the vehicle, and it will be pretty overwhelmed pretty quickly.
That's awesome.
Another thing to consider is that you have to pay attention to what the DAK player went for. So, for example, in the previous game, I went for the Brasilieri,
right,
which is a infantry unit that has no access to snares, meaning that if you do get the flank on the DAK vehicles, they have no way to stop them. So you need to acknowledge what your opponent might be missing. While as if they go for their mainline infantry, maybe they'll have just less infantry and a less powerful mid game than they would have otherwise. Yeah, my advice against the DAK and what I usually do is try to make your force as mobile as possible, so you can follow the DAK player around.
That's fascinating.
Right.
Very,
what about
very
you,
good.
Jason? Coming out of that match, what's sort of your big takeaway from that 4v4?
We stacked the teams too much. Yeah, no, like it's tough because we have built in so many different ways of playing the game. I definitely saw the player opposing me. Again, we'll name him Marco, but I don't know who it was, but really struggled to kind of mitigate the amount of damage I was doing to his teammates.
Mm-hmm.
Jason's
even though
loving
he could
it.
counter me. Like if we fought straight up, he would have just murdered me. But he couldn't do that because I was using mobility and hit and run to get around him, right?
Yeah.
But there's a lot of different ways to approach both playing the DAK and also countering the DAK, because one of the other things, like by no means is the DAK one note in terms of like it's just light vehicle spam, right? Like I think Miguel has pretty much gone the other way and he's just gone pure infantry. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways to play, and hopefully, as players get more familiar with it, we can see some of the more crazy strats start to emerge.
Okay, so I really want to kind of highlight what DevM was saying, because I think he has a lot of insight into the faction. So when you're playing the DAK faction against them, and you know the DAK is hyper aggressive, right, and hyper mobile, and they're going to be able to maneuver around the map better than you. A lot of players' initial reaction would be, okay, if the DAK is super aggressive, I should be super defensive. I should go for MGs. I should go for anti-tank guns. I should go for mortars to kind of double down on my defense and kind of weather the storm of the aggressive DAK player. But what DevM is saying, which I didn't necessarily think about, is you want to try and match them as much as you can. Mobility for mobility, right? Flexibility for flexibility, speed for speed, as much as you can. So you can kind of follow them around and force engagements as much as you can. Like DevM said, the Martyr anti-tank destroyer is very formidable head on, but what's its weakness, right? He's identifying DAK weaknesses, and he's showing you that if your DAK opponent goes for this Martyr tank destroyer, it's very one-dimensional in regards to it has to turn to shoot, right? It doesn't have the mobility to maneuver in one point and turn its turret at the same time, kind of hit and go, hit and run. It doesn't have that. It's a more static vehicle in general. And the Germans actually historically thought that the Stug, right, the anti-tank destroyer, the Stug would be a lot more effective than it was in reality. In reality, the same thing that Miguel is talking about transpired on the battlefield in the Eastern Front, where the Stugs were being outflanked, right, by T-34s, by Russian armor that was just more maneuverable. So I think that's really interesting. It's a really good insight into the game. So I love having. I wish we had DevM in the other videos, to be honest, but that was really good.
Yeah, and I imagine we're going to be paying very, very close attention after launch to the data that we're getting and some of the feedback that we're getting from players. And I know coming out of the tech test, we were actually really, really happy with how balance was looking. But I'm sure that your team has a lot of adjustments that they're going to want to make in the coming weeks and months. So we are going to be paying very, very close attention to that, and we're going to be making some tweaks here and there where we need to. So before we end today, folks, I just want to again let you know that if you want to stay up to date on everything Company of Heroes, you're gonna want to follow us on your social channel of choice at Company of Heroes on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Join us in the Discord and have some awesome chats with us and some of the developers. Discord.gg/Company of Heroes. You can follow us here on Twitch, twitch.tv/Relic Entertainment, and sign up for code development at community.companyofheroes.com. That's where you're going to find our forums. So before we head out for the day, folks, we are 2 weeks away from launch. We're incredibly
Super
excited.
pumped.
It's very palpable in the studio. There's a lot of final work that is happening.
2 weeks.
Things are getting ready. And we can't wait to put the final game in everyone's hands so you can enjoy, the dynamic campaign, the North African operation, all 4 of our launch factions in multiplayer and co-op. There's just so much in Co3, and I know the entire team is just incredibly excited for you to get your hands on it.
So much
before
hype.
we go, any final thoughts? Anything you want to say to the players, Miguel, before we say goodbye?
I can't wait for honestly the players to get their hands on the game and see what they come up with. I think it's always a lot different when you're playing internally, and there's definitely a limit on the player pool. So I can't wait to see what players come up with and how we on the live team adjust what they're doing in the upcoming balance patches.
Right, Miguel is just saying he's tired of embarrassing me in 44s.
And Jason.
Jason, what about you? Final thoughts as we get close to launch here.
I hope people are excited. I hope we've shown them that there's a lot of cool ideas. There's a lot to dig into the game, and we're going to be looking at how people respond to the feedback and how you guys engage with the game, and we'll be making adjustments and whatnot to make sure that all things run smoothly. As we know, there are going to be a few rough edges, but I hope for people's patience as we work them out. But I really do hope that they engage with a lot of the I really think there's a lot of cool ideas in there. A lot of builds, a lot of ideas that you could do that you couldn't do in prior games.
I agree.
So yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Absolutely. So I do want to thank both Jason and Miguel for joining me today. But before we go, I also wanted to thank our friends at Tactical 511 for providing the apparel for Miguel and I today. So thank you to our friends at Tac 511. We also have an exciting opportunity with Tac 511 to win some great prizing for all our players in the United States. You can find more info on that on our forums and on our social channels. For the rest of you, don't worry. Even though this is US only right now, we do have many more opportunities coming for you in the days ahead. So you're not going to want to miss those. So thank you, Jason. Thank you, Miguel. And we will see you folks at launch. Thanks again.
All right, guys, that's going to wrap up this video. I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. It was very cool to see the Afrika Korps and very cool to see DEVM give his insight. Jason was the top dog in these faction deep dives for the past few months, and then he just gets completely derailed by DEVM when he comes in. I thought that was pretty funny. He was quite the character. But overall, I know a lot of people enjoy the DAK faction. A lot of people in the community really want an Italian faction, and I can see that. I think that would be cool as well. But I love that there is a Italian presence representation in the DAK faction as is, and I think it's really important because many of you guys know this. Many of you guys are very well read in World War II history. Something that I learned recently is that Rommel was actually reporting to the high command in Italy, right, to Mussolini and the Italian high command. He was technically responsible to reporting to them, and I wasn't fully aware of that. So the Italian presence was in the North Africa campaign in the Mediterranean was vast. I mean, there was a lot of Italian presence there. Of course, there was German presence as well, and the German officers were overall, I think, as time progressed in the campaign, they were taking on more and more responsibility. Of course, with Rommel in particular, but the Italian presence, I mean, the Italian soldiers were good fighters under German command. I mean, they were. The issue was they were under-equipped and so forth, and I think the Italian military doctrine, was not necessarily up to par. I don't think the Italians were ready to fight in the desert when they had. I think the Italian army themselves wanted more time. They needed more time. They knew they needed to train and they needed to develop not only their tactical philosophies, but their weaponry and so forth. So they weren't ready, but Mussolini wanted to jump in right away. So anyways, I just love that there's an Italian presence in the faction because I think it's historical and it adds to the overall depth of the game. But if you guys like this video, go ahead and smash the like button, subscribe. It goes a long way in helping me as a new content creator for Company of Heroes 3. And I'll see you guys in the next one.